Gardens are a space for beauty, for celebrating the nature around us, for growing food, for throwing football around. They are spaces for daily life, for infrequent use, everything we can imagine. And they surround us. And for many of us, one of our greatest hobbies and passions is spending time in gardens and caring for gardens. And today on the show, that is entirely what we are talking about, specifically gardening here in Texas and thinking about how gardens can actually be a vehicle for resilience and really building a sense of place in where we live. I'm Weston Twardowski, the Associate Director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies and Associate Director of Eco Studio in the Rice Sustainability Institute. And you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Pam Penick is an Austin-based gardener and landscape designer who is renowned across the state, one of the best-known voices online through her blog, Digging Cool Gardens in a Hot Climate, which is an invaluable resource for folks thinking about gardening in Texas, although also folks thinking about gardening more broadly. She's also the author of several books, one of which she's here to talk to us about today on the show. Pam Penick, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
I am delighted to get to talk with you. You have a new book out called Gardens of Texas. It is beautifully photographed, and the stories inside are really engaging and just lovely to read through and kind of learn about some of these gardeners. And the information is so rich and helpful, I think, for folks who are thinking about gardening, that I'm just really delighted to get to chat with you some about the book. But before we dive into that, I want to hear a little bit about you and where your interest in gardening started, which I think at this point is
Oh my gosh.
many moons ago.
It was many moons ago. Yeah. I'm trying to think. I mean, it was probably, when my husband and I bought our first house, because
Mm,
that was when we had the first opportunity to mess around with a yard, right? I think
yeah.
that's true for a lot of people. Although I will say that my mom and my grandmother, grandparents on both sides also gardened. And I have memories of being with them in their gardens, and I'm sure that was formative. And I also was one of those kids who grew up just set free in the neighborhood to run around. And I have a lot of really great memories of, well, I call it like a free range childhood. And so I was just in nature, like we'd go outside in the morning and we'd come back in for dinner. And that was just a great way to grow up and to have this love of nature that I think stuck with me.
Mhm.
Um, but I didn't know I would be interested in gardening to the extent that I became interested in it until, we had that first house, and that was in North Carolina. And
Mm.
I can still remember planting my very first plant there. And it was with a lot of trepidation. Like I didn't know what I was doing, and I wasn't sure if I was planting the right plant or how to do it, but I can still remember it. And then we left that house soon after. We were only there a couple of years and came out to Texas and settled in Austin, which is where I still live. So that was about 30 years ago. And just really threw myself into gardening here, learned to garden by going to the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center,
Mm.
which is the state botanical garden, and it only grows native plants from Texas. And its larger mission is, of course, to share the excitement, the joy, the reasons for using native plants across the country. It's not just about growing Texas plants, but that was very formative for me in kind of forming the look that I
Mm.
enjoyed, because I'd come from the Southeast. That was all I'd ever known. I had not had any experience with gardening. And so suddenly I was seeing, this very Texas aesthetic. And you have to kind of maybe train your eyes to it in some ways, because it can be a much drier look than what I was used to in the Southeast. And I just loved it. I thought the plants were gorgeous. I started to fall in love with, yuccas and agaves that we can grow here. And And so I just started to garden like crazy. And around the time that I was really getting into gardening, I started my garden blog, Digging, which I
Mm.
still have today. So that's almost 20 years old. And found a community of fellow gardeners that way and found this passion for communicating about gardening that kind of led directly to, various other careers. Like I did a 10-year stint as a garden designer here in
Oh,
Austin.
wow.
And then I got into garden writing and did that for magazines for many years. And then that segued into books. And so, yeah, here I am. I mean, I don't really know if that answers your question, but it was kind of a lot of things that led me on this path.
No, that's great. I mean, I think so much of that resonates with both the kind of, having older figures, your mother and your grandmother who
Hmm.
exposed you to this. I think that's so common for folks to know folks in their family who care about that relationship. I think what I want to hone in on a little, especially from a number of my friends who are certainly not gardeners. But you mentioned that first plant that you put, into the earth in North Carolina. I think for a lot of people, gardening is actually really intimidating. The
Uh-huh.
idea of, I know with even people I know who have house plants or are thinking about getting house plants are very like, I might kill it. And I
Yeah.
will admit during the pandemic was when I started developing a relationship with actually caring for plants. And I think my attitude was maybe a bit more laissez-faire than a lot of people I know, where I was like, yeah, I'm gonna kill some of these, and that's fine. I just have to like be okay with that, and then we can go from there. But I think that's really hard for a lot of folks. And I think what's really interesting, and I mean, you've written 3 books now. One of the things that you think so much about is, what we might understand in kind of gardening circles is like the right plant for the right place. But actually, what you're thinking about is just, if we go with the plants of least resistance, if we go with the plants that are already ready for where we are, that failure rate's much lower. So I'm
Yeah.
curious about how much research you did before you started actually gardening. Did you feel like you could just jump in?
Pretty much zero. Yeah.
Yeah.
I really, I mean, it's hard to remember now because those were antique days. Those were ancient days before the internet and stuff. And
And it was a lot
I,
harder. Yeah. The
yeah,
internet's made it so much easier to figure things
it's
out.
easier, but there's also a fire hose of information. So I think you're exactly right that it can be very intimidating. And especially if you follow, like home and garden shows on TV where they
Mm,
make this magical transformation. And so you have this, this ugly nothing, and then they transform it into this place of incredible beauty. Or even if you're like flipping through a magazine or looking at something online and you see the end result, but you don't see the process. And so
mm,
you don't really get a sense of how that person got there. And it can seem like it just happens. And and I know because we've been doing it long enough that that's a years long process that never ends. It's an evolution. It's not the thing about a garden is it's not like a living room where you buy your furniture and you set it down and it's done and it's beautiful and that's it. A garden is constantly changing. The weather is throwing crazy events at us and we have to adapt to those. And so I think you're right. There is an intimidation to it. People feel like also that they're entrusted. I think this is a really nice feeling that they're entrusted with, or they're entrusting themselves with the lives of these living organisms. They buy this plant, they want it to live, they've spent money on it. It's not
yeah.
inexpensive. And so people can get really discouraged if a plant doesn't thrive or it dies. People can be very reluctant to, uproot something that isn't serving them because here it is growing and it's a living thing. So I think there are a lot of kind of barriers to entry, which is what you're getting at. And I'm not really somebody who thinks you have to do a lot of research to garden. Like I think that can be beneficial, especially if that suits your nature and you want to make sure and you don't want to make as many mistakes, but there's also a lot of value in making mistakes, in just
Mm,
trying things and experimenting. And one of the gardeners in the book I mean, he said it flat out, and I included that quote in the book because I thought it was so right, is that gardening is nothing but experimenting. And so for people who enjoy that process, and a lot of people do, right? They're willing to try plants that are kind of outside the box or something they're not sure will grow there, and they'll try it. And if it doesn't make it, they're like, that's okay, we'll try something else. But for people who are more worried, or, they're operating on a tight budget and they just can't afford to throw away money, that's where doing a little research and really, like finding a book that's about your region can be so valuable, because so much of the information that's out there is not applicable to Texas. And that
Mhm.
was what I noticed over the years and felt that we needed a resource. I mean, there are great books about Texas gardening, no doubt, and I have a shelf full of them. But I didn't see a book where they were showing like the range of the kinds of gardens and beautifully designed gardens and just that kind of inspiration, not how to so much as inspiration on what people are doing and how many different kinds of gardens there are and how gorgeously they're adapting and making gardens that suit Texas, that are representative of Texas. And that's what I hope to do with the book,
No,
along with take home information, because there are take home pieces that that are very applicable, to people's own gardening practices at the end of each garden. But yeah, I was thinking bigger scope, and we just didn't have it. I saw it for other regions, but nothing for Texas. Yeah.
well, and I think that, yeah, I love that. It's one of the things that, you've divided the book into kind of regions within Texas. So folks can
Hmm.
immediately go and there's a lot of overlap and kind of crossover between those as I was like kind of
Yep.
glancing through, as you mentioned, at each, in each of those sections, you have these kind of breakdowns of, ideas for resilience, for good things to do, and looking across them, I think almost every region, one of the things you have is like put in rain gutters.
Yeah.
And I mean it's a small thing, but
Or
it's
rainwater collection. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so you get this idea of like, right, Texas as a whole does have some commonalities, and also we have really distinct areas as well. And I think that's interesting because Texas is so big,
It's
so
massive. Yeah.
much, so much
And
of,
I think that's partly why we didn't have this kind of representation, because it's not like you can just say, okay, here's what you do in Texas.
yeah,
I mean, it's a desert on one side, the Chihuahuan Desert, and then, where you are in the Gulf, I mean, that's like a lot of rain, sometimes
yeah,
too much rain, and totally different soils, different altitude. So, yeah, it is a challenging place for many reasons, but also those challenges make it very rewarding, because I think we do kind of have distinctive kind of cultural practices that we do in Texas that I don't see as much in my garden travels in other parts of the country. Like especially in regard to trying to hold on to rainwater. Like
mm,
there's a lot of places maybe that are drier than us where they haven't, it seems like they haven't done that as much. And people have commented on it to me when they've come to see Texas gardens from other places, just how much people are investing in rainwater capture, and having, whether it's just a little rain barrel in their yard or a big cistern. We have a lot of those big cisterns, especially here in Central Texas, where it's drier than where you are on the Gulf. And yeah, rain gardens, different ways of harnessing the water. Texas is always about either not enough water or too much water. Like
yeah,
that is the common denominator. And there's that saying that Texas is a place that's perennially in drought until it's broken by flood. And so when you're a gardener in your own little plot, you're having to figure out ways of dealing with the rainfall one way or the other. And so I saw that again and again and again in the gardens that I visited, whether it was on a small scale or a bigger scale, in terms of like the amount of water they were trying to collect and then use through their irrigation system, or in the gardens that were closer to Houston or in Houston. Those folks, a lot of them were really thinking about ways of keeping the water from flooding their
hmm,
homes, from tearing up their gardens, but also not to just send all that water down into the storm drains, with all that entails. They were trying to hold on to the water and reduce like the paving in their yards so that the water could soak into the soil. So I thought that was really cool. I mean, that's people are really, they're really thinking about it and thinking about ways that they can help on a micro level just in their own yards.
well, and I think it's something that, in Texas, we feel these climate conditions acutely in a
Hmm.
way that, I think people around the world are feeling in real ways in the last few years more than we had. We've talked about climate for a long time at this point, but I think the impacts of what change means are really starting to hit in a really physical, tangible way. But in
Yep.
Texas, I mean, that means we know we have water insecurity issues. We know we have prolonged drought periods and the damage that can entail. And at the same time, if you're in Houston, you've been, around at least people who flooded. That's just
Yeah.
it's impossible to live in this city and not be cognizant, even if it's the level of just driving down the street when there's a heavy rainfall and realizing like, oh, I'm going to have to pull over into someone's driveway for half an hour until this passes. We are
Yeah.
so familiar with flooding that I think it's kind of impossible to be in the state and not be thinking, if you're thinking about what plants do I want, how do I want to live here, that right, my choices have some impact. And I think what's
Yeah.
great about the book, I didn't plug your subtitle yet, which the book is Gardens of Texas, and I think that is absolutely what the book is. But the subtitle is Visions of Resilience from the Lone Star State. And I
Yeah.
mean, very much what you're thinking through here. And what I love about this book is that you are thinking from this really aesthetic place. I think so often when we think of native plants, when kind of in the popular vernacular, people hear about resilience or infrastructure. These aren't things that seem pretty. These aren't things that
Uh-huh.
seem, attractive. And you're kind of like, oh, the last thing I want is to live next door to like some big water storage facility for rainwater runoff. And then as you're talking about these cisterns, I mean, I'm looking at images from the book. And not only are you absolutely right that like these cisterns are things I do regularly see in Central Texas, they do feel kind of like a cultural vernacular now that it's like, oh
Hmm.
yeah, that's very familiar. They're also attractive. Like they
Yeah.
really they fit this kind of chic farmhouse style that is very in, and you're like, oh, but it's real. It doesn't feel like fake and kind of put here. It's like this is truthful to where this place is. And so
Yes.
I'd love to hear you talk some, because I think this is such an important part of what's often missing in some of these conversations about gardening, and especially native plant gardening, that we kind of have the idea of like, oh, it can just run wild and do its thing and that's great. And in reality, a lot of people really do care about the way their lawn looks. And what you've
Absolutely. Yeah.
assembled here is a book that shows you can have both. You can have really, plants that are doing wonderful things for our environment and where we live, and that are beautiful, that feed us, that are doing all of these things at the same time.
Yeah, I feel really strongly about that because I did come up into gardening from a native plant perspective, and then I ultimately, found other plants too that I love. So I am not at all a native plant purist. I don't think anybody in the book is either. And
Mm-hmm.
people in Texas do, I think, favor native plants more than maybe some other regions. And I think that's because we have to, because it is a challenging climate in terms of heat and drought. A lot of people, I think, have been early adopters of native plants, but by no means does that mean that's all that they're growing. And there are many, many, many wonderful adapted plants that grow very well here too. So to your question, absolutely. I think a lot of people have this mistaken impression that native plants just means, just like a very naturalistic landscape and it can't be designed or it doesn't have any structure. And when you look at it, it's going to look a little weedy at certain times of the year. Um, that's really too bad because native plants are just plants, and every plant that's in at the big box store that's not a native plant that you might find there, that's a native plant somewhere too. Every plant is a native plant when you think about it. It's just if you're focusing on the plants that are native to your own region, that does things that it gives you a sense of place, like it kind of
Mm.
grounds your garden or your landscape in the place where you live. So there's value in that. It's not like that's the end all be all value, but I like that. I like I mean Lady Bird Johnson, that was kind of her ethos was, she liked the idea of places looking like where they were, like Vermont, looking like Vermont, and in Minnesota looking like Minnesota, and Texas looking like Texas, and whatever that means to you. I mean, it's obviously going to vary from one side of the state to the other. And it doesn't mean you can only plant. I mean, that I just like, I'm not a big believer in like rules about that kind of thing. And I think the book shows that like
Yeah.
people are doing a variety of not just styles of gardens. And there was one in West Texas in Alpine that I featured that uses pretty strictly, I think it was all Chihuahuan desert native plants,
Mm,
but there was a formal designed garden in the front yard. And I called that out in the try this at home. Like you can use those native plants in any style of garden as that garden showed. You know, it was laid out in a formal way with a formal structure, and instead of choosing, you know, things like boxwood or you know, azaleas or whatever, like it was choosing plants that suited that style, but that were suitable to the Chihuahua Desert. So I think that's important to remember that all plants are native plants in just depending on where you are. And when you choose the ones that are native to your region, they just have a little extra head start in terms of adapting to these climate extremes because we're really seeing not just the heat and the drought, which we've always had, but are longer now. You know, every year it seems like we're breaking new records in terms of hottest summer on record or that sort of
yeah.
thing. But also these cold events, you know,
Mm.
like Winter Storm Uri brought extreme cold here now. And so native plants have a little edge, like they have evolved to handle those extremes, whereas other plants maybe not so much. So that's one advantage. But I forget what I've rambled on so long now, I forgot what your original question was, but
No, that's perfect.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly thinking about the aesthetics of this, and I love what you're hitting on. I think I want to say one thing really quick, which is I think you're absolutely right. Part of the reason native plants are so popular here is we do have these wild, just like far crazier kind of conditions weather-wise than a lot
yeah,
of other places. That it's like the easiest thing for you is to grab a plant that's already like, I am prepared for heavy wind, I'm prepared for lots of rain, I'm prepared for no rain, I'm prepared, those are
right.
those are great plants to go to. I will also say though, I think Texas is a really interesting place. Listeners who listen regularly know I'm from Louisiana, and I was looking for some resources for Louisiana friends who are interested in more native plant gardening. And I was realizing we're actually incredibly spoiled in Texas between the Lady Bird Garden Center, between some of the state resources that exist around education and offering, courses and materials. There's a wealth of information. There's also a lot of across the state. Uh, Garden facilities that are actually
Are
really tapped in where you can
yeah.
go to your kind of like native plant store and you probably still want to learn and do research and think about it if you're really into that. But like you have knowledgeable folks there, you have spaces that are actually growing these. And I really couldn't find anything comparable in the state of Louisiana.
Is
Um,
that right? Wow.
and I mean,
Yeah. I
I'm not
do feel
saying
like we're
I'm
spoiled. Yeah.
yeah, I'm not saying I'm exactly right. There could be one that I missed, but like I
Yeah.
definitely did some internet sleuthing to be like, oh, here you could go to. And I was like, nowhere. I can find nowhere that like
Yeah.
is thinking about this. And so I think we're really fortunate that culturally Texas seems almost ahead of the game to me from a lot of
Yeah.
places in thinking about this is how we want to live here and how we want to think about that. Um,
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. We have a wealth of botanic gardens. You know,
mhm.
Houston's got the newest one, I think, in the
Which is
state.
lovely. We've had them
It's
on the show to
fantastic.
talk before. Yeah.
Yep, yep. And you know, and then everywhere you go across the state, you'll find a botanic garden. You will go online and you'll find a lot of gardening resources on how to have a garden that is well adapted to the climate.
Yeah.
You know, I that's definitely true here in Austin. I've seen it. You know, I mean, these are resources that sometimes the master gardener groups put out. Sometimes the city, like the city of Austin, has a grow green program. San Antonio was really ahead of the game in terms of water conservation with their
Yeah.
SAWS program, in encouraging homeowners to conserve water in their landscape by, you know, by their gardening practices. So I think we have been early adopters on, you know, not just native plants, but water conservation. And it's probably the constraints of our climate because we do live in an extreme climate. Um, and we have this whole culture of gardening here, which is represented in the established botanic gardens that we have, that people have been very forward thinking. And there's a lot of really smart designers out there, landscape architects who are incorporating all of these ideas into their work. Not every garden that I featured in the book was a designed garden. Some, I mean, they were all designed, but you know, some were had brought in designers or landscape architects. Some of them were their own home gardens, which is always fun to see what like
Yeah.
a professional designer will do in their home gardens. But others were homeowners like myself who had just found a passion for making a beautiful garden and a passion for plants. And it was really great to see what they were doing too, and how they were making a garden that was responsive to the climate that they found themselves in. Yeah, that I mean, it's endlessly fascinating, I think.
Well, and I think something interesting too, that because you had mentioned at the start that, Texas has a kind of interesting aesthetic. You had mentioned, this kind of like Texas feels like Texas, and then
Hmm.
kind of nowhere else. At the same time, Texas is so diverse that different parts of Texas can feel quite different. But I'm sitting here and I'm just thinking to myself, if there's one thing Texans do not lack, it is Texas pride, right? And I think there's something interesting to that idea that I think a lot of folks just kind of jump on board with like, yeah, I want my yard to give me that Texas feeling, to really feel like a beautiful Texas space. And I bring that up to also pause because one of the things you mentioned, the Vermont feeling like Vermont, the folks who are very, attached to this place. I think that's really human. I think especially, Texas brings in a lot of people from all over the world, not to say just all over the country. And I
Yeah.
think it's really normal for people to be like, well, I loved X thing that I grew up with and I want it. And we see that
Uh-huh.
especially in Houston, where there's a huge, immigration culture in the city. And folks bring their favorite plant, and you can find gardens where folks are raising interesting foods from wherever they came from. And so you have this incredible kind of biodiversity, this bizarro ecosystem we've sort of engineered here in Houston. But I think what's really intriguing, you have this beautiful section, and I say to listeners, if you look through the book, as we mentioned, each section kind of goes through the different regions of the state, and then within that there are five or six gardens that you highlight and the gardeners who make them, and really interesting stories about them. And one of the ones you think through, the whole piece is about memory and how gardens evoke memory. And it kind of starts off with this like, well, this person came to I believe Houston, and had come from somewhere else and was very like, I want it to look like, the gardens of where I grew up, and realized, okay, this is not does not translate. And
That was
then
such a theme. Yeah.
yeah, and like and how people adapt to that and find other styles that, there's a point where it's like, well, I love a kind of Italian style, and like I have fond memories of Italy. And what you point to is like, well, actually, like there are overlaps in these kind of arid environments. You may not be able to plant the exact Italian plants, but you can do a lot of that kind of, hardscaping that gives you some of the
Hmm.
sense of that Tuscan environment, and then use native plants that evoke that. And you can use, well adapted plants and a mix of Italian plants that will do well here. I have lemon
Yeah.
trees in my backyard.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think that's a really interesting way to imagine these spaces. And as you said, it's a common theme. So can you talk a little bit about that theme of just how people adapt these spaces, work with the plants we have here to create a sense of place that feels homey to them? Because I think that's so much
Well,
what we want in a
I
garden.
love what you brought up there about how the garden as memory, a garden is autobiography in many ways.
Mm,
A garden is not just the plants that you're selecting. It is also you. There is no garden without the gardener. There
mm,
it just isn't. If you create a garden and you move, that garden is going to be gone. Even if the new owners were to take it up and keep it going, it's still not the same garden because the person who tends it is such an essential part. And I think that's really remarkable and beautiful in many ways to think about that. So whatever you do in your garden, it is a reflection of you.
mm,
And whether you're thinking about it or not, right? You come, you bring your ideas about gardening from wherever you grew up or wherever you had maybe gardened previously, or another country, you come and you want to grow some of those same plants. I love that idea because the gardens are telling our stories. And that was part of what I wanted to convey too. These are Texans, but they weren't always Texans.
mm.
Maybe some of them were. Some of them have always lived and gardened here. Others came here from other places and became Texans. What did that mean to them? What did they bring from where they came before in terms of how they would garden, or maybe a place they vacationed and inspired them and wanted to bring home. Like you mentioned, the garden in San Antonio, where the homeowner was so inspired by, well, first she brought her idea of gardening in, I think it was Michigan, and this very flowery place, it was somewhere in the upper Midwest. And then she realized those plants were not going to thrive in San Antonio's heat. And so she pivoted and she was like, oh, I love the Italian landscape. We vacation there. I'm going to bring, and those are evergreen gardens. I'm going to bring
Mm.
that aesthetic, but grow with plants that will do well here. So that's telling her own story. And I saw that over and over again. And it was, for me as a gardener, like I love reading what inspires people and understanding those stories. And so I definitely wanted to include that. I mean, along with all the pages of eye candy, because that's what everybody wants when they're wanting to be inspired and they want to see what people are doing. It's got all of that because I worked with an incredible photographer, Kenny Braun, who traveled with me around the state to
They are
capture the
beautiful
photos.
images. I mean,
They
it's
are so
really,
gorgeous. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's just stunning gardens, which is actually I really wanted to ask about. I mean, these gardens are just gorgeous. I mean, they are just really incredible, and there are a variety of things. Where you have one in the Heights that it's not a tiny garden, but it's also pales in comparison to some of these desert spaces that are
Yeah.
much larger, clearly. And so I'm curious about how did you find the folks for this book? How did you seek out and discover these beautiful spaces?
That was a process for sure. The book was shot between April and November of 2023. So that was a year of just, driving across Texas. Literally drove 6,000 miles that year, myself to scout gardens. But backing up before the scouting, I did have to find these gardeners. And, here in Central Texas, where I've been living for 30 years, I have a lot of contacts. And so it was kind of a wealth of gardens that I knew were available to me here and different designers and homeowners I could reach out to. But in other parts of the state, not so much. Like I especially didn't know as much about, I didn't have as many contacts in East Texas or West Texas. Those areas were just less familiar to me. So I started reaching out to everybody I knew, designers, anybody who might have contacts with people across the state, gardening figures, and people were so helpful. I've just had many people spend time suggesting gardens to me, offering to let me see their gardens, and so then once I had enough contacts and that sort of thing, that I would drive out to those areas and I would put together garden visits and just see as many as I could and talk to the gardeners or the designers, because in addition to wanting to choose a representative number of gardens from each of the 5 regions of the state, I also wanted to have diversity of style, diversity of um, uh, personal stories from
Mhm.
each of those regions. And so then it was a process of visiting the gardens and taking a look at them and talking with the gardeners to understand what motivated them, if they were thinking in some interesting way about how climate change was impacting their garden. And some were thinking about that far more than others. But that wasn't the only criteria I was looking for. I wanted to be touched by their stories. I wanted to understand what made them gardeners and why they were so passionate about it. Because I don't think it's so easy to be a gardener in Texas. I think you have to mean to be.
Mhm.
And I wanted to know why it was so important to them to have a garden. And so that's reflected in the stories that they told me and that I wrote about in the book along with the photos. So yeah, I really do feel like I ended up with a huge range of not just garden styles. So, it's not just a bunch of naturalistic gardens. Like there are formal gardens, there are traditional gardens, there are
Food
cottage
gardens.
gardens, there are food gardens. That's right. There's even one family farm in the
Wow.
valley that I thought was fun to include. So yeah, I mean Texas is a huge and diverse place. I mean Houston represents that maybe more than any other city, right? In terms of that kind of international diversity. But I wanted to convey that we're doing not just one kind of gardening here. People are doing all kinds of things and really creative things. And I think that gets overlooked. I don't think Texas is well represented in gardening media, and we should be because we're doing some really cool and forward-thinking things.
Well, and I completely agree that you've accomplished that task. And I'll say it's a really fun read for folks who are just interested in gardens and don't know a lot about gardening in Texas. but also I will say for the kind of uber garden nerds of the state, it's really fun. I mean, you're going through, and maybe I would argue maybe the most recognizable gardener in the state, John Hart Asher, who hosts Central Texas Gardener, which is a wonderful PBS show resource that I think lots of folks who are interested in gardening across the state have at least at some point, watched clips of, if nothing else.
Yeah.
And getting to peek literally into his backyard and see, what his garden looks like is
And
really fun.
he is so eloquent too. Like talking to him is just it's just wonderful because he has really thought deeply. I mean, he's a landscape architect, so he's got that background, and he's also a big believer in prairies and restoring
Hmm.
prairies and um, doing all that he can there. He's got this other whole side thing of creating green roofs in Texas
Yeah.
that are adapted for our intensely hot climate, because so much of the green roof research was done in much cooler climates where those plants would just melt on the roof. So he's got an amazing amount of knowledge, and but like he's also just like a fanboy of nature. Like he is so into the wildlife and stuff that his garden brought into his yard, and he was like
Yeah.
rattling off all the animals, that he had seen visiting his garden, and that just brought him such a thrill. So he was a great interview. He was really fun to talk with, and just his passion for plants, totally shines through. And then yeah, like you say, just like a peek over his fence to see what he's doing in his own home garden.
Which
Um,
is, I mean, parts of it, he gets into the pocket prairie concept, which is so popular. And I mean, there are parts of his garden that do feel in many ways like, oh, this is the most kind of wild nature feeling almost of any in the book that I've seen. And then there are also spaces and images where you're like, oh, this is really well thought out and manicured. And there's room for both within the same house. And I mean, I think that's
Yeah, that's what he said.
really,
It's yes, and he was big
yeah.
into that because it's not like there can be a lot of guilt in the gardening world, especially around native plants. Like there can be this pressure to just only have native plants, and you're not doing it right if you're not planting these plants. And I think every gardener I spoke to, especially the ones who were into native plants, really kind of pushed back on that concept. Like there
Mhm.
shouldn't be so much guilt, or like consider these kind of plants if you want to be a more successful gardener, because these plants will serve you well, right? Like there's that positive impulse toward why you might want to consider more native plants. But there's also a whole range of adapted plants that do really
Mhm.
great across Texas. And why not use those too? And so he was very much of that mind. And you're right, he did have one of the wildest kind of gardens, right? He is full on pocket prairie in his yard. And by pocket prairie, he just means like a small space
Yeah.
prairie. You're planting prairie plants in a small urban yard, but he did it with a very contemporary sensibility. Like the layout of his garden, he has it kind of like the pocket prairie runs through the middle of this long, skinny backyard up closer to the house, which is very contemporary in style. There's like a small lawn, and then he's got that round, perfectly, round geometric pond that's set into the
Mm.
foreground of that prairie. So it gives that structure, which was really nice to see. And then in the back, he had installed a pool for his family to enjoy, and he had a native lawn around it. But he had this very contemporary layout for that, with that like triangular arbor to grow vines on. So there was so much
Mhm.
geometry to create structure in that yard that you don't feel like it's just this wild, woolly, overgrown,
Yeah.
thing at all. It's got style, it's got form.
Absolutely. You don't feel lost in it at all. And yeah, and I mean, I love to your point, he's a landscape architect. He knows a lot about this, but you also have folks who are just home gardeners who've done
Mhm.
incredible things on their own. And I as someone who, I've tried a lot in my own garden to really favor native plants, and especially with the kind of, conservation crowd that I run with. It's something that I've highlighted. And at the same time, I'm like, I grew up, my parents had gardenias, and I just love gardenias because they remind me of my literal house, not even, New Orleans is home, just like the house I grew up in. And I was, it makes me happy to have a
Mhm.
gardenia bush in the backyard. And the same, I got,
Kind of more where I come down. The other idea, rather than doing all this experimenting, is just really kind of honing in on those plants that you know are tried and true. And so
mm,
maybe that gives you a smaller plant palette to work with than you would have in the past. Um, it feels like used to we could grow any number of, like evergreens and stuff like that. And then Winter Storm Uri culled those, and those didn't come back. So I'm going to focus on these plants that I know will survive both the heat and the cold when it comes. So, it's just different ways of approaching it. And there's no right way.
It's also really useful actually, because I do want to pull us a little bit over towards maybe novice or beginner gardeners and
Mhm.
shift us a little bit to thinking about Houston in a second. But I mean that idea of kind of limiting the palette to the most, likely to thrive kind of plants actually is I'm annoying because I'm one of these artist types who always preaches, constraint is actually a blessing. Like having constraint actually really helps you to figure out things and
Yeah.
understand how you can be imaginative and limit some of the craziness of like do anything. And so I think, that idea of like having a starter palette of like, I know these plants are going to do really, really well here. And then you can experiment beyond that. And that
Yeah.
feels less like, well, I can just try anything and more towards, all right, I know I want these to be a good base. And then
Mhm.
from there, I can play and add on. So this is your third book, and the previous two, in a similar vein, very much, this has resilience in the title, but I mean, your previous books, The Water Saving Garden and Lawn Gone, I think also thinking very much about, low maintenance, sustainability, resilience, and ways to create ecologically sound and beneficial gardens that are also, yeah, highly aesthetic, highly engaging, meaningful to people. And so we are in Houston. We are in a place that is prone to a lot of severe weather and climate kind of events. And so for those beginner gardens in Houston, or people who are maybe just thinking of doing a garden refresh or whatever it may be, can you just walk us through some basic starter tips? Of course, the book has this great information, has a list of plant palettes as well that folks can look to directly, but maybe just some places to start. What are some recommendations you have for Houston gardeners who are interested in thinking about how to make a more resilient garden?
Well, like you said, you want to invest in plants that will be good backbone plants that are not going to be taken out by the first,
Mm,
surprise freeze that hits Houston in, 5 years or whatever. And that can take our other extremes. And so I would advise people to, well, I mean, if you're really starting from scratch, it's kind of like, are we adapting a garden that's already existing, or are we, like, there's all different ways of thinking about it. But really you want to kind of evaluate obviously your conditions, and you want to understand, that's the first basic step, is to understand, what do I have in my yard already? Do I have a lot of trees? Does that create shade all day? Is it super sunny? You want to understand those things before you even start thinking about plants. And really, even backing up before that, uh, think about how you want to use your yard. For
mm,
some people, maybe this is the first time they've ever really thought how you might want to use your yard. And especially a backyard, most of us have thought, well, I need a barbecue patio. I want a place for the kids to play. I need an area for, sandbox for the kids, or for my dog to run around. But sometimes people don't think about that for their front yard, and they might have. Yeah, most of us have a lawn because that's what came with the house. And what I really encourage people, especially in that first book, Lawn Gone, was to uh, think about that as something that you can actually use, whether that means you're going to live in it in terms of maybe a front yard patio, or uh, have more habitat plants instead of lawn. So you can really open up the possibilities when you include your front yard in it, depending on your HOA and all that kind of stuff. But I think there's a lot of possibilities in a front yard that people overlook, because it's always like, I can do all this in the backyard, but nobody does that in the front yard. But people
yeah.
do, and I think it's inspiring, and it doesn't have to be everything. I think it's so important when you're planning a new garden to think about places for you, and not just have it all be plants, because that's expensive. Like, it's expensive to buy plants. It can be. I mean, you can also get plants for free, and many of the gardeners in my latest book talked about how they grew plants from seed, or from divisions, or they go to plant sales and get small plants. But when you're starting out, if you have to go out and buy a bunch of 1 gallons or 3 gallons, that's going to cost some money. So it's much less expensive to have a gravel patio in your front yard or a paver patio. And then that gives you that welcome that you get for a human space. You know, you put a couple chairs out there. Maybe you never sit in those chairs. Maybe they just sit there and look pretty, but it's like a welcome to your house. And then you can surround that with plants. So
Mm,
that's a design, that's from my designer days. Like the both of those earlier books that you mentioned, Lawn Gone and The Water Saving Garden, I was at the time doing landscape design mostly for do-it-yourselfers here in
mm,
Central Texas. And we had been going through the record drought at that time, which
mm,
was like a 5 or 6 year drought, which culminated in 2011 as like kind of the peak of that drought. And all during that time, Austin was on um, watering restrictions. You know,
mm,
you could water once a week. Some areas could do a little more, some areas could do a little less, but it was, once a week watering. And people were finding their lawns just drying up, looking bad. And so I was getting all these calls from people saying, "Hey, I don't want to pour water on my lawn. I can't because I've got these water restrictions. What else can I do? What other plants could we put in? What can I do to make my yard pretty and also be responsible with water use?" And so that was all that I was doing during that time, was pretty much helping people come up with ideas for alternatives to just a big old lawn that was shriveling up and drying and
mm,
looking really sad. And a lot of that involved creating spaces for human activity, play spaces or patio spaces to enjoy, and then planting really water-wise plants around that. And then at the time that I was so invested in that, the publisher actually approached me and said, "Hey, we're looking for somebody to write a book about lawn alternatives. Is that something that you'd be interested in?" And I was like, "That's all that I am doing right now. Yeah, I would like be happy to do that." So Lawn Gone came out of that, and then I followed it up with the Water Saving Garden a few years later because Texans are being so creative.
mm,
Like I was seeing um, all these different ways of holding on to rainwater so that it has time to soak into the soil. Because if you don't do that, then when it rains and your soil is hard as a rock and cracked with, the clay, you just got cracked clay, then that water just runs off. And so there's different ways of being creative to make sure that your garden can let that water soak in, but also in a similar fun way. And a lot of people told me this was their favorite part of that book, The Water Saving Garden, just creative ways to celebrate water. And Christy
mm,
Tenike is a designer, a landscape architect based here in Austin, who has a lot of amazing experience with that. She talks about celebrating the path of water in a garden. So maybe it's a dry creek until it rains and then it fills with water, and it kind of, you don't need to hide runoff away in a pipe and pipe it out to the street and send it out to the storm drains. Instead, celebrate the path of that water through your garden, and then have that water go into a pond or a rain garden or something like that. That was really inspiring to me. And I put it into effect in my own garden, in my last garden. So I had a rain barrel right off the gutters, and then I ran that into a dry creek, the overflow into a dry creek, and then I ran that out into a rain garden. And man, did those plants grow great. Like those, they got an extra drink of water every time it rained. And those plants, there was a cedar elm in there. They grew so fast. It was really inspiring to see. Like if you can hold on to that rainwater, harvesting it, then you can reap the rewards of that extra rainfall too, without you're not having to do anything extra. You just get that extra bit of rain. That's what I see a lot of Houston gardeners doing when I was interviewing them for the new book.
mm,
Like Dixie Friend Gay was talking about, she's an artist in Houston, and I featured her garden. She took out a bunch of just concrete patio in her backyard
mm.
that she felt was contributing to runoff issues, like that water didn't have anywhere to go. And so it just sheeted off all that concrete and contributed to flooding. And she backs up to a little tributary of one of the bayous. So her garden and her home were vulnerable. So she pulled up a lot of concrete patio and made more open garden space for that water to soak in, basically creating, how like I mean, you've talked about this on your show, how important like the marshes are and the Gulf prairies to absorb all that water,
Yeah.
because otherwise that water is going to go somewhere. You can do that on a micro level in a home garden, to some extent. I mean, obviously, you still want to keep water from pile it up next to your foundation. You don't want to damage your home and stuff. And so it's worth consulting an expert on all of that. But even home gardeners can make a difference in all of those. And I saw that repeated in multiple gardens. Mark McKinnon is another Houston gardener, and a landscape architect in Houston who talked about that. And he said, this won't work for everybody, but this is what works for me. And he doesn't do the gutter thing. He just lets the rainfall come into his backyard, which is a teeny tiny little backyard in the Heights. And it all like slopes down toward this little retaining pond, this little
Mm-hmm.
geometric rectangular retaining pond, and that lets it have time to soak in and recharge the soil and help all of his tree roots. And that was his process for they're thinking thoughtfully about what to do with the rain, how to hold on to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that the Texans are really being thoughtful about that you don't maybe see in so many other parts of the country, except probably in the desert where they're really focused on harvesting as much rain as they can too.
Yeah. What an excellent place for us to wrap. Pam Penick, thank you so much for joining us. It has been a delight getting to chat with you and to learn more about your new book, Gardens of Texas, Visions of Resilience from the Lone Star State. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I love chatting about gardens and what Texans are doing. So thanks for the opportunity.
Now we'll go to our researcher, Sophia, who has a short piece for you all about Bethel Park here in Houston.
It's Sophia, and welcome back to Urban Explorer, where we find wild places and city spaces. Today, we're going to visit Bethel Park. For those who haven't gotten the chance to visit yet, hopefully I can sway you. But before I do that, I wanted to share some information about the area. Bethel Park was founded in 2013 and happens to be situated where the old Bethel Missionary Baptist Church, which was one of the oldest churches in the Fourth Ward, used to be located. The church was founded in 1891 and was built by emancipated slaves alongside Reverend Jack Yates. The church unfortunately faced a variety of difficulties, including a hurricane and a couple of fires. But now, the three walls, floor, and concrete pillars that remain have been stabilized, and the plot of land has been restored into a public park. Without further ado, let's go check it out. So I just left Bethel Park and I took some time to go around the whole property, look inside of the old church building, and enjoy some of the natural amenities as well. So I can confidently tell you, you should definitely check this out. As you walk in, the first thing you see is this huge, beautiful building that used to be the old church. It has these lovely colored glass windows coming in all different colors. And as you walk into the building, they have information plaques all over the place, just telling you about the area, the history of the church, and even more beyond that. So this would be a great place to come with family and friends if you're in the area, or even if you just want to learn more about this historical part of Houston's Fourth Ward. Even if you just want to come sit out on some of the benches under the trees, enjoy the natural scenery, it's a great place to come relax, learn something, and get outside a little bit. So if you're thinking about it, definitely do it. As I mentioned, make sure to come check out Bethel Park if you want to learn more about the history of Houston's Fourth Ward, or even if you just want to rest and soak in some of the nature on the property. The story behind Bethel Park is definitely worth a visit to learn about, and the maintained and serene natural areas on the property beyond the church are surely an added bonus. As the city of Houston continues to change, visiting this park and others have been a good reminder to me to appreciate the history of the city as well as the almost therapeutic effect that can come from spending some time in little pockets of nature. Thank you so much for tuning in, and make sure to come back soon to learn more about unique and fun parks in the Houston area.
That's our show for this week. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081. That's 713-348-4081. Or email us at westont@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe to make sure that you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Sarah Tabrez and Antaravama. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.